Hello and welcome back to the Policy Advocacy online lecture series. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 6 of Jansen's textbook. This is covering macro policy advocacy. Macro policy advocacy, in differentiating it from micro and meso policy advocacy, is where you actually work with government institutions. Most of the time when people think of policy work, they think about working in the macro setting and working with governments and all of those kinds of things. So we're going to start off with discussing some of the skills that you would need to work in such a setting. We're also going to discuss the same kind of how you engage in the 8 challenges that are inherent in any kind of social policy work, and we'll discuss how we're going to make it all fit together. So first off, let's look at our skills. So the first off is when we work in macro policy, typically we're working with legislators, we're working with politicians, we're working with big bureaucracies. And in order to get the attention of big bureaucracies, you've got to be able to be organized. That's primarily one of the first ones. You've really got to be organized. If you're not organized, it's a really messy process and it's going to be hard to get things done. So it's not just a matter of organizing your thoughts and organizing your paperwork, but it's also about organizing people. Can you help recognize people who are going to be assets for you and utilize their strengths to the best effort of the policy you're looking for? Those are the kinds of questions you need to ask. Next, you need to establish policy goals. What is it that you're actually trying to accomplish? As we had talked about before, understanding values is an important part of policy work. And if you can sell your policy proposal in a macro level, if you can sell your proposal to politicians based on values that they would all share, that's often a winning strategy. Specifying a proposal's content. So what kind of stuff is actually going to be in your proposal? Sometimes it helps to get professional writers for this kind of thing. With experience, you can become a professional writer of policy. But it's one of those things that when in the real world, when you're debating policy in a public setting, people will fight you over minutia. So just be aware that what goes in, every single word, is very important. Establishing a style. So this is your style or your approach to working with politicians or to putting together proposals or working with different organizations. Generally, this falls along a continuum of being silent and we're just kind of doing our thing over here, to being out and out combative and making lots and lots of loud noises to get a lot of attention. And you could be somewhere in between. You might take loud proposals on some stances and some on others, but you've got to be able to make sure that you've prioritized and established a style that goes along with your priorities. Deciding who does what, making sure that you can delegate well. Implementing the strategy, make sure that you have a way to actually make sure that things work out. When it comes to implementing the strategy, one of the things that you're going to have to do is make sure that you can work with anyone and everyone. Now, as I've mentioned before, and I'm sure many of you have noticed, lots of social workers tend to be fairly left-leaning. But having said that, a good social worker will be able to work with anyone across any level of the spectrum, because power shifts and power changes year after year and decade after decade. And if you really want to be effective in the kind of work that you do, you've got to know how to work with people across the spectrums. And then finally, being able to revise your strategy is another important skill. Diagnosing who stands where and recruiting people to a cause. So this is where we look at some additional skills that are necessary in making policies happen. So one is framing issues to gain support. You're going to want support from everyone. And as I was saying earlier, making sure that you can sell your ideas and your policy proposals to anyone based on values and based on their own ideals. If you can sell something to the ideals of politicians, that will be a huge benefit to you. Uh, Politicians, of course, are interested in their base in getting reelected, but they are also interested in their own little pet ideas and their pet projects. And so it's worth knowing what those are and making sure that you can frame the work that you are doing in a way that meets their goals. Networking and coalition building. This is the ability to actually work with people, even if you think that they would be atrocious to work with. As I was reading through this chapter, the anecdote at the end discusses something that happened in Utah, working with trying to advocate for some policies to help out women and children. And one of the things that they talked about is how they worked with the Eagle Forum. And for me, I remember learning about the Eagle Forum in my very first policy class and learning that, this is a very, very conservative, right-wing organization that's very pro-gun and anti-anything liberal. And I just kind of like, wow, this is a really kind of evil organization, I thought to myself. And it was interesting to see how in the example that's discussed there, she talks about how she was able to network and reach out across and actually even work with the Eagle Forum to make sure that her policy passed. And so, yeah, being able to do that, that's a tough thing to do. You've got to swallow your pride and you've got to swallow some of your prejudices and your preconceived notions about people in order to move these kinds of things forward. So be ready to do that in a macro setting. Using procedural power, managing conflict is exactly what it sounds like. So using procedural power is going over and making sure that you've got the right people to help sponsor your proposal. This really matters because if you don't have someone who is in a particular position of power sponsoring your project, it's not likely to go anywhere. So make sure that you've connected to the right people that will support you. Develop and using personal power resources, so building up your own credibility, building up your own leadership skills and your own organization if necessary. Develop credible proposals, so with practice, coming up with a proposal that is realistic, that can be implemented and is light on the budget. Those are things that are always going to be concerning politicians when they move forward with policies. Negotiating skills, we've talked about that in previous lessons, and then developing power by changing legislators' environments. What we're talking about with this is that when you work with legislators to get them out of their comfort zone or get them out of a place where they are used to being, sometimes talking to a legislator outside of a common area that they go to, like the Capitol. They're at the Capitol all the time. They're at their office all the time. They're at offices and lunch meetings all of the time. So if you can get them somewhere else and meet with them there, sometimes that can be a great way to help get them on board with things. And then, of course, developing personal connections, which is an important part of building a long-term network. So when you move forward with macro level policy advocacy, some of the things you need to really understand are the contexts. And this is where you really have to understand what government is and what it's made of. So I'm sure by now you should all know what the executive branch is, what the legislative branch is, what the judicial branch is, what an elected official is. So I'm just going to cover that really, really briefly. Obviously, the president is going to include whoever is elected as president or governor or mayor in whatever the setting may be. for whatever organization you're working in, whether it's state government or city government or federal government. So the president is elected, of course, through the college of the electoral college. So the people vote, and whoever wins what state, those referendums are given to the electoral college, who will then make their vote for president. So it's not really a direct election by the people. It goes through a different kind of process, but in the end, we have a president, and the president can set the agenda for policy, but in the end, the president can't actually write any policy other than giving executive orders. I'm sure many people have criticized Barack Obama for using a lot of executive orders, but not in defense of him necessarily, but just as a description of the process, is that his executive orders were offered in the absence of legislative support. When policy agendas are ignored, and they often are, and they're often defeated by legislation, then they do what they can with what they have, just like anyone else. The president does have some power. The power that a president has, though, is largely over his departments. And so the executive orders that he throws out there, he or she, throw out there as the president, will affect the way the different departments, such as the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Defense, or whatever those departments are, those executive orders influence those, just as an executive of an organization can issue orders to the rest of the organizations that they are in charge of. And that's where those executive orders primarily work. When it comes to laws that affect society at large, you have to go into the legislative groups, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The Senate, of course, are there for much longer periods of time. They're there for about 6 years, and they tend to take on larger scale projects. They think bigger than you would see in the House of Representatives, because House of Representatives are only there for 2 years, and they cycle in and out a lot more frequently than senators do. So you get a lot of a power base with the Senate, but sometimes getting the attention of a representative is the easier way to go, because there's more of them and they're a little bit more accessible than senators are. Of course, within the legislative process, there are groups such as advocacy groups, so groups that champion particular populations or causes. NRA is a big one, of course. AARP is another big one, as well as the National Association of Social Workers, the NASW, or NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. So those are just some examples. There's lots of them out there. And those people will lobby with the legislators to try to influence them to make decisions one way or another. Oftentimes they will find themselves opposing policies or supporting different policies. Sometimes they're even writing policies. The reality is that while you do get a certain sense that, oh, it's the lobbyists that run everything, because the lobbyists can just give money right over to the politician's campaign fund, and then the politicians are in the pockets of those lobbyists. While that does have some truth to it, the reality is much more complex than that. Because one of the things that you'll find is that politicians are not really as dumb as they look or sound. Sometimes politicians get a really bad rap because of some of the things they say. I think of Representative Butters here in Utah, who called a particular bill a black baby and something that he didn't want to touch. I mean, something so terribly racist, it really shocked a lot of the country, let alone the state. But one of the things that he was also able to do was he was able to fight for and ensure that a particular policy called the DORA program, which is the Drug Offender Rehabilitation Act, became part of Utah's permanent legislative budget. It was no longer up for discussion. And the DORA Act was actually a very, very good program. It was a close collaboration between mental health and criminal justice professionals that provided excellent outcomes for people who were in jail for criminal issues or for drug-related issues, and we're able to get out to get treatment early.